So in the last section, you learned about property and event binding. We use property binding with the square bracket syntax to bind properties of DOM objects to fields or properties in our host component. That is the component that is using that DOM object, in this case, this image object. Another way to think of this is that this source property is an input into this DOM object. We use this to supply data for this object, to supply some state. Now, similarly, we use event binding to respond to the events raised from a DOM object, in this case, the click event of a button. But this favorite component we implemented in the last section, it doesn't have any property and event binding. It's not very reusable. Ideally, I want to set the initial state of this favorite component using some object that we have in the host component. For example, here in app component, let's say we get a post object from the server. So let's go to app.component.ts. Okay, so here I want to define a post object. This post object has a title and also this isFavorite property, and I'm going to set this to true. Now for now, let's not worry about the complexity of getting this object from the server. Let's just imagine we have this object in memory. Now in the template for app component, we want to display this post, and if it's set as favorite, we want to render this favorite icon as a full star. So back in the template, here, unfortunately, we cannot use property binding to bind this isFavorite field of the favorite component to this post object that we have in this component, .isFavorite. This is not going to work. Let me show you. First, let me delete these two lines so we focus only on one thing. Now back in the browser, look at this error. Can't bind to isFavorite since it isn't a known property of favorite. So this property binding doesn't work. Even though in favorite component we have this field called isFavorite, and this is a public field. Because in Angular templates, in order for you to use property binding, you need to define that property or that field as an input property. And that's what I'm going to show you in the next lecture. So to make this favorite component more reusable, we want to add support for property and event binding. For example, in the future, we want to be notified whenever the user clicks on this favorite component. For example, we want this favorite component to raise a change event like this. And we want to be notified and call a method in the host component, in this case, app component. So onFavorite change. And inside this method, we can call the server or do something else. Once again, to add support for event binding, we need to define a special property in this favorite component that we refer to as an output property. In other words, in order to make a component more reusable, we want to add a bunch of input and output properties. We use input properties to pass input or state to a component. And we use output properties to raise events from these custom components. The combination of input and output properties for a component make up what we call the public API of that component. Public API, which stands for Application Programming Interface. So now our favorite component doesn't currently have a public API because it doesn't have any input or output properties. And in other words, we cannot use property and event binding here. So over the next few lectures, I'm going to show you how to add support for property and event binding to this favorite component and make it more reusable.